Another is that that controversy highlights elements of science that lead publics to be critical of science. And so to air controversy is consequently bad for science in general. What's missing from all of this, I would argue, are reasons why, in fact, controversy or journalistic coverage of controversy can be a good thing. Okay, and I'm oversimplifying this, but one is that, for one thing, controversy is indeed a natural feature of science. So if you are trying as a communicator to convey a nuanced understanding of what scientific process is, of the uncertainties that get built into science, of the challenges of trying to determine what's true about anything, dealing with controversy is a way of conveying that. Another reason, I think, is what we have learned over time is that controversy is a major alerting mechanism for audiences. If you are writing a story and you can legitimately indicate in that story that people disagree, you have now, your audience is glued to that narrative. And what some scholars have learned, I think thinking of Phil Titchener and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota some years ago, is that stories about controversy actually enhance learning in audiences. In other words, we're paying a lot more attention to those stories than we are to other types of stories. So if there's an honest controversy, you can actually help people learn about science through that coverage. And finally, and this is very interesting to me, is that controversial science and presentation of controversy actually is important to the relationship between science and the rest of society. In controversial issues, that's me, and it just does that. I don't know why it just did that, so don't worry about it. Anyway, in controversial issues, in many occasions, scientists are just as reliant on the mass media to figure out what's going on as are the rest of society. And it's really quite remarkable to watch this. I've seen occasions where scientists in a controversial situation, scientists on one side of the controversy will say to journalists, you know, when you learn something more about what the other side is saying, share that with me because I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. And so what controversy does is again, I think, increases the extent to which science is actually interacting with the social structures around it. And so I think there are some really good aspects to controversy that are not acknowledged in the critique. So given that, why does journalistic coverage of controversy have such a bad name? And again, in the United States, the default is to assume that this kind of coverage is flawed coverage, fundamentally flawed, and to critique it heavily. Well, one reason is that it is often badly flawed and misleading. Okay, this is a silly postcard from a community called New Madrid, Missouri, right in the. We're almost, when you hit this part of Missouri, you're now entering the South in the United States. It's a nondescript little community, but it has one very singular characteristic, and that is that it sits on a major fault line. Running down through the center of the United States is a large fault line that I think most recently in 1811, did what fault lines do every so often and produced a 7+ magnitude earthquake with an epicenter in New Madrid, Missouri. So this is a part of the United States that's sitting on an active fault line. But in this particular case, the story I want to tell here occurred in 1990 when a self-characterized geologist by the name of Ibn Browning declared that there was a 50-50 chance of a major earthquake with an epicenter in New Madrid, Missouri, and he gave a specific date, let's say June 30, okay. I mean, literally comes out with this prediction. Ibn Browning claimed that he had been had successfully predicted a previous California earthquake, and so was a credible expert when it came to this particular prediction. Journalists did what journalists often do. In this case, they covered the Ibn Browning and his prediction seriously, okay. A few of them contacted geologists with the U.S. Geological Survey and were told by those individuals that this is nutty, okay, that Ibn Browning is not a geologist. That there was no scientific evidence that a major earthquake was that likely to occur. All these geologists acknowledged the presence of the fault and the inevitability of a major earthquake at some point, but there was literally no diagnostic information that suggested that an earthquake would occur 50-50 chance by June 30. So our U.S. stories got written in classic U.S. ways, okay? Some journalists just reported on what Ibn Browning said. Others created stories that here's Ibn Browning making his assertions, and here are the geologists saying, oh, balderdash, this is not going to happen. What did happen as a result of this is that thousands of people fled the area, okay? Again, you can sort of imagine think of what you might do in a situation like this. All you see is, a fairly high uncertainty situation where somebody seems pretty darn certain there's going to be an earthquake. The precautionary principle alone would drive you away from your home. So people emptied the stores, took off on impromptu vacations, literally fled southern Missouri. And guess what happened? Nothing, okay? There was no earthquake. Of course, Ibn Browning was wrong, just as the geologists had predicted. And yet, here were a whole spate of stories that treated this issue as a controversy and that appeared to have done a grave disservice to audiences, okay? And so when we think about the bad name that controversial coverage has, this is the genesis for that critique, okay? Because a lot of stories get written like this, maybe don't have such dramatic repercussions, but have bad repercussions nevertheless. So why is this, okay? Take this kind of an example. Why would journalists do this? Why would a journalist hear an assertion from someone they don't know and decide that the best course of action is to provide that information to the public, or at the most check it out, and then having learned that others feel that the assertion is bogus, write a story that essentially provides both those perspectives. And this was one or the other characterized the coverage of this issue. Okay. Well, I think the reason these things happen is something I call the validity problem in journalism. And again, I'll invite you to respond at the end. I don't know if you're seeing Canadian journalism in any of this or not. I can certainly talk about the American patterns, but in America, journalists in the United States have a very, very difficult time deciding what's true in a controversial situation, and an equally difficult time communicating what's true to audiences. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So let me articulate those. One is that, classic journalism problem. In any particular issue, the complexity of the issue literally precludes that writer from being able to do a thoughtful, deliberate analysis of the situation. Every once in a while, a journalist will have a PhD in that arena, that specific arena, and might feel more comfortable judging the truthfulness of the claims that are being made. But more often than not, a journalist encounters a controversial science arena and is not really able to burrow into the science at a level that would permit her to decide who's telling the truth, okay? So one big issue is the complexity of information. Another equally big issue in the United States is that we expect our journalists to be neutral information transmitters. So when a journalist attempts to make a truth assertion, attempts to say, well, here's this so-called geologist and here are these real geologists. If I were you, reader, I would listen to the real geologists, because that's what I'm doing as a journalist. If a journalist tries to do that in the United States, they actually get very negative reactions from the public who don't believe that it is their job to analyze those different perspectives, okay? And I'll talk about that a little later because I have a strategy that I try to convince journalists to employ, and even that strategy is a problem because it does call on journalists to attempt to share with readers or viewers that one particular perspective may be, in Colbert's sense, more truthier than another, okay? Anytime you try to do that as a journalist, you have a problem, okay?